In our last lecture, we saw how Woodrow Wilson recognized the first revolution in Russia, the February Republican Revolution that overthrew the monarchy, that overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. For Wilson and for a lot of Americans, this was a progressive thing to happen in Russia, the overthrow of a monarchy, and Americans began to anticipate Russia moving closer toward the American model of a constitutional democracy. And of course, that did not happen. Nonetheless, the Americans do recognize the first ambassador that is sent to the United States by the Russians, by the Russian Provisional Republican government, Boris Alexandrovich Bakhmeteff. Bakhmeteff will remain ambassador right up until 1920, even though the provisional government is overthrown in the October Revolution, the second revolution in 1917. Bakhmeteff will remain as the only legal representative of the Russian government that the United States will recognize. And so the Russian embassy in Washington becomes this kind of funneling source for money to finance opposition groups against the Soviet government, if you want to call it the legitimate government. Certainly Americans will denounce the Soviet October 1917 revolution as a illegal seizure of power. We talked about Wilson's notion of ethical diplomacy in previous lectures, and so ethical or non-ethical, a lot of American dollars are now issued through, as I say, the Russian Provisional Government in exile, if you want to call it, through the Russian embassy, until in 1920, as the Civil War is beginning to wind down, Bakhmeteff finally just resigns. And now there is no representative. The formal diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia will be interrupted until 1933, essentially. And oddly enough, much of the money that the Americans advance first in the First World War, but then, of course, during the Civil War to white authorities, Americans will later make a claim on that money as being loans advanced to Russia and expect the communist Bolshevik government to pay down on those loans as part of the price for recognition. Although sometimes it's used more as an excuse, as of course the Bolshevik government in Moscow just digs in its heels and refuses to now recognize those payments as legitimate. And so diplomatic relations are suspended. There's no American ambassador or embassy in Moscow after October of 1917, and certainly no formal Russian embassy or ambassador after 1920, and certainly no ambassador representing the Soviet Union. And this kind of suspension of diplomatic relations will now become the status quo under Warren Harding, the president who enters office after Woodrow Wilson. It remains the status quo under Calvin Coolidge, and continues to remain the status quo under Herbert Hoover. three presidents. Although there are informal representatives of the Soviet Union, usually through the form of trade commissioners, various Soviet state companies, trade companies that are acting almost as a embassy inside the United States. But again, there is no kind of formal diplomatic recognition of each other. In reality, the United States, however, or American business, is doing a tremendous amount of business inside of Russia, and even more as the Russians are now attempting to industrialize. This is nothing new. Americans, of course, have been doing a very lucrative business in Russia since the revolutionary era. They built a great part of the Russian railway, all sorts of infrastructure. The Singer Company, for example, had branches in Russia. The manufacture of sewing machines, of course, was very, very important to the labor market in any industrializing country, as of course the sewing machine was something that often female workers would do piecework on at home. So this became owning a sewing machine, of course, became a very important piece of capital for a worker to make an income. And in that attempt to, of course, industrialize, the Russians welcome American corporations and expertise. Ford is in Russia immediately, building factories. They will be producing for right through, I guess, the Second World War, vehicles for the Russian market. The Gaz, essentially a Russian name, but is a Ford vehicle. And Arm and Hammer, of course, is in Russia. Oil companies. There is this booming trade and travel between American business and the Soviet state, which is, I say, welcoming this presence in Russia. And as you can see from these tour posters, these are not exactly tourists. These are obviously businessmen traveling to the Soviet Union looking for financial opportunities. There is as well political and social travel. A lot of progressive Americans are looking toward exploring firsthand this new utopian revolutionary society. There are, as the Depression arrives in the United States, there are a lot of Americans and Canadians that are seeking employment in some of the American Western-built companies in Russia, as they bring a kind of expertise that many Russians themselves don't have. And again, as I say, there is this kind of political incentive as well for young women and young men to travel to Russia, almost a version of, I would say, the kibbutz in Israel. There is this kind of period of time that young socialists, young communists would dedicate working on the land in Russia, helping rebuild Russia after the Civil War, and again in its factories. So as the Depression begins to take hold after 1929, this flow of Westerners to Russia is beginning to increase as in fact there's more employment opportunities in Russia than there might be at that point in North America. African Americans as well. The 1920s and 1930s are a particularly bad time for race relations in the United States, as the second Ku Klux Klan begins to rise to become the third largest political organization in the United States after the Republican and Democratic parties. There'll be millions of Klansmen. Lynchings are on the increase in this era, and so a lot of African Americans find some kind of dignity and shelter in the Soviet Union, like, for example, Robert Robinson. Robert Robinson is a toolmaker, experienced in tool making for Ford in Detroit. When he arrives in Russia, very quickly begins to rise in the factory management in the way he certainly could not have back in the United States in Detroit. He becomes an engineer eventually. Robertson even is elected to the Moscow City Council. He is kind of welcomed as a propaganda symbol as well of a kind of Russian Soviet progressivism. And of course, it's not going to go well for Robertson in the end. After he's elected to the Moscow City Council, the United States will strip him of his citizenship. And then the Russians will not allow him to leave until the 1970s. He finds himself without American citizenship, trapped inside Russia. Every time he asks for an exit visa, it's denied. And somewhere around 1974, after 50 years of being trapped in the Soviet Union, Robertson eventually manages to make his way to Uganda. And there from Uganda, he will be able to slowly make his way back home to the United States. What changes, of course, is the coming of a new presidency and a new era in American politics, in American history. Roosevelt is, of course, an American aristocrat of the Roosevelt family. He is related, of course, to Teddy Roosevelt, the president of the United States at the turn of the century. He has this aristocratic pedigree, as does his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor, of course, will be one of, if not the first active first lady in the United States in the history of the American presidency. She will essentially define this kind of new role for the president's wife as a social advocate. Roosevelt himself is a member of the Democratic Party. He is a former Secretary of the Navy in the First World War. And in fact, when the Second World War comes, that will give him some kind of understanding with Winston Churchill, who was, of course, the Lord High Admiral in the First World War of the British Navy. So the two of them kind of as Secretary of the Navy and the Lord Admiral have a kind of at least understanding of naval power and its significance in global warfare. Roosevelt is the first disabled American president. He, in the 1920, contracts polio at Campobello in the Maritimes. Although this is the only, or one of the few only known photographs of Roosevelt in a wheelchair. This is essentially kept from American people, and Roosevelt learns how to make speeches kind of propping himself up The press, of course, is very cooperative in not photographing him while his disability is exposed. Or certainly not publishing any photographs if they occur. So a lot of American people never realized that Roosevelt was confined to a wheelchair. And often you'll see him seated in this way, covering up his disability. Roosevelt, of course, runs for public office in New York. He is a New Yorker, and he'll become the governor of New York. Again, as I say, a very progressive politician. He's the one that kind of takes the Democratic Party from its conservative roots. Remember, the American Democratic Party is the one that was pro-slavery. It was Lincoln's Republican Party that was the progressive party. And under Roosevelt, of course, this will turn around. It's Roosevelt who essentially liberalizes the Democratic Party and makes the Democratic Party what it is to this day. This kind of the left wing, as left as you might consider the Democratic Party in the U.S. But Roosevelt is the one who, again, positions the Democratic Party in American history as this progressive movement. And a lot of people begin to look to Roosevelt to save the nation from the Depression, which certainly Herbert Hoover is completely failing to do. And so in 1932, Roosevelt will now be elected as president of the United States. And it's not exactly that Roosevelt changes American policy. There has been a decade of pressure, especially from American business, again, from American progressives, from the American left as well, to recognize Russia, the reality of Russia now as this emerging power in Europe, as Stalin is rebuilding Russia, is part of the motive as well. Roosevelt is certainly a pragmatist. And so the pressure was there already, but presidents like Herbert Hoover, Harding, and so forth were not ready to change the status quo. And Roosevelt, of course, rips up the status quo in many, many different ways. And so the Russian foreign minister, Maxim Litvinov, who's a professional diplomat, Stalin's, as I say, Minister of Foreign Affairs up to the end of the 1930s, will now negotiate the diplomatic recognition between the United States and Russia. They will settle the reparation payments. They will settle a number of outstanding issues left from the First World War, but essentially in November of 1933, Roosevelt, United States, will now recognize the Soviet Union, and there will be, for the first time since 1917, formal ambassadors and formal diplomatic relations restored between the United States and the Soviet Union. Much of this has to do with what happened in the Soviet Union since the Civil War. In 1924, January, Lenin dies. And of course, that changes many things. It's going to bring Joseph Stalin to power. And Stalin is going to be with us now for nearly the next 3 decades. He will be essentially driving American-Soviet relations, American-Russian relations, right through until 1953, when he dies. So we're talking about essentially from the end of the Russian Civil War to the war in Korea in the 1950s. So he will become this dominant figure as presidents after Roosevelt will be changing, if not every 4 years, then every 8 years. Roosevelt, of course, serves this extraordinary 4 terms, and afterwards is a constitutional amendment absolutely prohibiting any president to serve more than 2 terms. And so there will be this changing parade of American presidents, but Stalin will remain fixture. He will be the last of the World War II great power leaders to still be in power in the 1950s. As we know, Roosevelt will pass away in 1945. Churchill will lose his election bid at the end of the Second World War, or at the end of actually the war in Europe. Interestingly enough, the British do not re-elect Winston Churchill, the hero, essentially, who saw Britain through its darkest hours. But, we're getting a little bit ahead of us. So it is certainly important for us to understand who Stalin really is. The best source on Stalin in a very chronological order is what will be a 3-volume history by Stephen Kotkin on Stalin. Only 2 volumes have come out last year. The 2nd volume had been published 1929 to 1941, waiting for Hitler. This is probably the definitive biography, certainly the most detailed biography available now today. And Stephen Kotkin is currently working on the 3rd volume, the final volume, which will cover 1941 to his death in 1953. As I understand, it's going to come out in another 2 years, but an excellent, very recent history, biography of Stalin, and basically written in a straightforward chronological, week by week, essentially account of Stalin's rulership. Stalin, of course, is not his real name. He was born in Georgia, 1878. His birth name was Yosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili. He is essentially a foreigner, if you want to look at it from the Russian point of view. He is born in a very nationalistic region of Imperial Russia, Georgia. Georgia has its own language, its own alphabet, as you can see from this diagram. And Stalin, in fact, never really masters the Russian language. That's why you don't see very many public speeches delivered by Stalin. Stalin spoke with a very thick Georgian accent, and often was embarrassed by his inability to speak a accent-free Russian, and despite the fact that he is leading essentially the new Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. Joseph Yugashvili, also known as the Raboy, or the pockmarked one, also known as Koba. Koba was this kind of Garibaldi-like figure in Georgian history, a Georgian patriot that Stalin, as a young man, admired and used the name Koba when he engaged in revolutionary activities in Georgia. He was also known as Zahar Melinkhanets, also known as Nijaradze, also known as Joseph Stalin, the man of steel. Raboy, the pockmarked one, of course, he had smallpox, and you don't see it often in photographs, but Stalin's face was scarred very heavily with smallpox scars, thus Raboy, the pockmarked one. He also, one of his arms was shriveled. He's almost a Shakespearean character with these physical defects that are constantly covered up, very much like Roosevelt's disability. Stalin's, I've never seen a photograph of Stalin's shriveled arm, his hand. It's always kind of very well hidden or airbrushed out as his face. This is essentially the propagandistic image of the Vozhd, as he's known, the boss, the secretary of the Communist Party, which is his official position. And of course, during the Second World War, or as the Russians refer to it, the Great Patriotic War, Stalin will also become known as the Generalissimo. But this, as I say, is the propaganda image, his face carefully airbrushed of any kind of scars, as most photographs of Stalin will be. And of course, it's Stalin that gives us that term, the cult of personality. This is a term that Khrushchev will use when he denounces Stalin during the 20th Party Congress in the 1950s, denounces Stalinism, and essentially in Russia, Stalinism will become known as the cult of personality, but it will serve as a lesson plan for many dictators to come, from Pol Pot to the North Korean dictators. Even Saddam Hussein was a great admirer of Stalin and his style of leadership and the cult of personality. And in fact, Stalin and Saddam Hussein have these kind of almost mustache-like similarities in their features. Stalin is a brilliant young student. He wins a scholarship to a seminary, which is a post-secondary, in other words, education in Georgia. His mother is deeply religious and will remain close to Stalin even when he becomes the party secretary and the leader of Soviet Russia. His father, we know less at. He apparently is a cobbler. There are allegations that he beat his son, but those times, discipline, children were of course disciplined with corporal punishment, so it's hard to say to what extent Stalin's father might have abused him, and he kind of vanishes from the historical record. We don't know very much about Stalin's father, as much as we do about his mother, who, as I say, survived into the 1930s. Stalin, when he arrives at the seminary, still does not know how to speak Russian. And so it's the priests, essentially, at the seminary that will begin to whip Russian into him. And it's here that Stalin begins to find his Georgian nationalistic identity. It's here that Stalin, chafing under the priests' corporal punishment, begins to resent the Russian Empire, begins to resent this forcing of the Russian language on him. He joins the first revolutionary movement he can find, and at first it's essentially about Georgian nationalism, but slowly, as a young man, Stalin will now become indoctrinated in socialism and eventually communism. He essentially joins a revolutionary movement as a Georgian patriot, but over the decade, he begins to adopt a more global vision of a workers' society. And he becomes a very prominent member of the communist revolutionary movement, not only in Georgia, but eventually in Russia itself. Stalin is a violent revolutionary, less of an intellectual, more of an action taker. He leads a cell that finances the revolutionary movement in Georgia by committing bank robberies. And so he'll find himself arrested a number of times for various criminal offenses and political offenses as well. He is hardcore. And while Lenin, after 1905, Trotsky as well. Trotsky is in New York City. Lenin is, vacationing in Capri. He is living in London, Switzerland. Stalin remains inside of Russia. Stalin has virtually no experience abroad, and that will certainly mark him when he does become the leader. His kind of lack of understanding of other cultures, of how other societies function in the way that Lenin certainly saw in London, in Zurich, the way Trotsky saw in New York. Stalin has none of those advantages. He, as I say, remains holding the fort back in Russia as the senior members of the Bolshevik Party are all abroad in exile. Stalin will marry a Georgian woman, Ekaterina Svinadze, and tragically, we don't know exactly whether it's smallpox or tuberculosis, but during the First World War period, she will pass away. And they'll have one son, Yakov, who I'll return to later. Stalin will rise in the party as the party secretary. It's a very clever choice for him to accept the appointment as secretary. It's an appointment that nobody wants because, of course, it involves all this bureaucracy. Everybody wants to be the Commissar of Foreign Relations or the Commissar of War, the Commissar of Industry. Nobody wants to be the secretary. Stalin, of course, accepts that position. It would be an unrewarding position, except that Stalin will now use that position to leverage himself into power. It immediately, of course, as party secretary, that's a very powerful position, puts him next to Lenin. It also gives him the power to start appointing his own functionaries throughout the Soviet Union, because that's what the party secretary does. He approves those appointments. And so Stalin very gradually begins to see the entire Soviet state with his hand-picked appointed allies. And that will be key as well later for his bid for power. And so certainly Stalin now becomes Lenin's right-hand man, especially after Lenin is shot and incapacitated himself. This is the state that Lenin is reduced to. It's the only known photograph of how Lenin actually looks shortly before his death, to the point that by the time that Lenin is facing his own death, he will write a letter to the party warning them of Stalin's growing power and his ruthlessness, but by then it will be too late. And so once Lenin dies, there is, of course, a struggle for power, as lots of individuals in the Politburo, in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, see themselves as legitimate heirs to Lenin, and particularly Leon Trotsky. But by then, Stalin will, over a period of approximately 4 years, between 1924, maybe 2 years, between 1924 and 1926, he will maneuver himself into power. He will do this through a series of, as I say, alliances, isolating one enemy after the other, rearranging his alliances, betraying his allies for the next elimination, and he'll work his way through all the senior members, and eventually he'll put them to death. So he has his own tight little group, and Stalin will often recycle his friends. The closer you are to Stalin, the more you are his friends, the more chances are is that Stalin will eventually begin to see you not as a friend or an ally, but as a potential rival, and will put you to death. So to survive Stalin is just a remarkable, as Khrushchev described it, almost an acrobatic act. Khrushchev, of course, is one of those ultimate survivors of Stalin, as will Molotov be, Stalin's eventual foreign minister. Trotsky is not only the biggest problem for Stalin, he is one of the biggest problems for the West's recognition of the Soviet Union. Trotsky's position is, of course, that the Soviet-Russian Revolution is just the beginning of a worldwide class revolution. And that's why we have Trotskyism still to this day, a surviving movement. Trotskyists, of course, see the Russian Revolution as not as a nationalist event in Russian history, but as an event in the global history of the working classes. Remember the slogan of the International, which Trotsky is, of course, one of the founders of, the Communist International, the Comintern. Workers of the world, unite, throw off your chains. And of course, that was the position, of course, of Lenin as well, which is why Lenin takes Russia out of the First World War, which begins this kind of breakdown of relations between the West and Russia. And of course, Trotsky symbolizes communism as this global revolutionary threat. Stalin will take an opposite position. Stalin's official doctrine will become make socialism strong at home first. And so Stalin turns communism essentially inwards. The mechanics of a communist dictatorship of the proletariat should make the Soviet Union stronger. And when the Soviet Union becomes a strong country able to stand on its own feet and rival the other great powers like France and Britain and the United States, Stalin says, then we can start thinking about global revolution. But until then, what's important for us is to get along with our capitalist neighbors and make Russia strong on the basis of trade and industry. So certainly from the moment that Stalin comes into power, Russia will begin to actively seek recognition of Western states. And the Russians, the United States will be the last to come on board of the great powers. France will recognize Russia and begin to rush in there with projects, and Britain will as well. Germany, of course, Weimar Germany will, as itself considered to be a renegade state after the First World War. Weimar Germany and Russia will become very close until the coming of Hitler in 1933. In fact, the Weimar army will be secretly training inside of Russia, outside the view of the Versailles Treaty commissioners. German officers are perfecting what will become known as the Blitzkrieg in Russian tank schools, in Russian chemical warfare schools, all this being done secretly. Essentially, Stalin is allowing the Germans to develop the strategy with which they will later turn on him in 1941 in Operation Barbarossa. That tells us a lot, certainly, about how secretly belligerent the Weimar Republic was, outside, again, the supervision of Versailles Treaty commissioners. And Hitler, of course, once he comes to power, will reverse that friendship to one of hostility between Russia and Germany until the 1939 Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, or Hitler-Stalin Pact, as it's known. Again, I'll get to that in a minute. So certainly Trotsky is the last formidable enemy, and Trotsky essentially describes Stalin as the grave digger of the revolution. And so eventually Trotsky will be expelled from the Communist Party and from the Politburo. Had this been a little bit later, this would have been a sentence of death for Trotsky, but Stalin is not yet powerful enough to put an individual like Trotsky to death. And so instead, it becomes this prolonged battle to the death, where Stalin ends up expelling Trotsky. Trotsky goes into exile. And of course, this expulsion of a left-wing global revolutionary and this declaration of socialism in one country, socialism at home, this makes Stalin very palatable now for Americans. It's the position that many Americans now begin to take in terms of whether to recognize the Soviet Union or not, is that the Russians have sobered up. They realize that just how utopian this notion of a global revolution is. They're no longer a revolutionary state, but now just a pragmatic state with which we may find some kind of accommodation to do business with, despite the fact that they're communists. And there's nothing that the Russians, excuse me, there's nothing that the Russians are saying or claiming that contradicts that under Stalin. Trotsky, of course, becomes the symbol of Stalin's betrayal of the revolution. As I say, he's characterized by Trotskyites as the grave digger of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky will now, as the 30s arrive, face various assassination attempts. Turkey is no longer safe. He ends up 2 years in Norway. Norway is no longer safe, and eventually Trotsky has to make his way as far away from Stalin as possible, which is Mexico. He'll settle in this armored villa in Mexico. It's now the Trotsky Museum. It's the site of his assassination as well. You can see kind of the fortifications up on top where Trotsky's guards were positioned, his bodyguards. And Stalin by now is deeply regretting allowing Trotsky to leave the Soviet Union. And so there are numerous attempts on assassinating Trotsky. In fact, his home will be machine gunned at one point in Mexico City, but these assassinations continue to fail, and Trotsky continues to write against Stalin, continues to essentially characterize him as the betrayer of the revolution, and it's dividing many communist parties around the world as well. And the Comintern has quite a challenge to keep global communist parties aligned with Moscow's objectives and with Moscow's policies. And so there's a lot of internal turmoil in the world communist movement because of Trotsky. He definitely needs to be removed as far as Stalin is concerned. And that, of course, will happen in 1940 in Mexico. A agent of the GPU, which is what the KGB was known at that moment, will penetrate Trotsky's inner circle. And one day, visiting Trotsky, who that agent befriended, he will assassinate Trotsky by driving a mountain pick that he smuggles into Trotsky's office, battering him on the head with a mountain pick as he's sitting reviewing an article that the agent had written extolling Trotsky's genius, and asking Trotsky if he would review the article. And as Trotsky's reading, he just comes up behind him and fatally strikes him on the head. Trotsky will die in the hospital. There's the mountain pick that he had smuggled in under his long coat. It's now displayed again in the Trotsky Museum in Mexico. The assassin, a Spanish Civil War veteran, he, as I say, is recruited. He's sent to Trotsky under a Canadian passport. Mercador is his name. He is captured by Trotsky's bodyguards and beaten up, but otherwise not severely injured. He will be, Mexico, of course, doesn't have a death penalty, so he receives a life sentence, but a life sentence often means release in 20 years, and that's precisely what happens. He'll never speak about his intelligence connections. He refuses to comment or make a statement to the court about his assassination of Trotsky. And after 20 years, he's released. He gets on the plane, flies to the Soviet Union, and then from the Soviet Union very quickly ends up in Cuba, where he'll live out the rest of his life in retirement. He will be awarded the hero of the Soviet Union in the 1960s for his assassination of Trotsky, the kind of Trotsky hate will continue throughout the Soviet regime. Even when I was in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, Trotsky's name was absolutely verboten to mention Trotsky's name, even as late as that. So Mercador is given the Hero of the Soviet Union, which is equivalent to the Victoria Cross in Britain. It's the highest award that is given for distinguished, heroic military acts, and this is how the murder of Trotsky is characterized. It's a very simple, small medal, but this is, as I say, the Victoria Cross or the Medal of Honor in the U.S. It's equivalent, and he'll die, I think, somewhere in the 1960s in Cuba. He'll pass away, never having revealed any or admitting having acted on behalf of the GPU. It's only in the early 1990s that his supervisor, Colonel Sudoplatov or General Sudoplatov of the KGB, will eventually write his own autobiography and will describe kind of the mechanics of recruiting Mercador, how he was, issued with this Canadian passport and so forth, and sent to assassinate Trotsky. So this tells us a lot about Stalin's method and methodology. And of course, this is just the beginning of this very complex psychopathology of a man who, as I say, is going to have a tremendous impact on our world, and of course, primarily through the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War in U.S.-American relations that just was, although should have been unexpected, was nonetheless unexpected. Nobody thought it was going to take that direction, and as we move forward, we'll see what direction certainly Roosevelt and Stalin thought U.S.-Russian relations would have taken. But death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problem is certainly the motto of Stalin in many ways, and not just personal single assassinations, Putin style, but mass murder as well. Stalin, by the 1930s, will have eliminated all his rivals and will begin to now aggrandize himself as the great generalissimo. He's almost like a pharaoh with his own architecture celebrating Stalinism. I mean, there is, a definite Stalinist architecture. The city of Moscow has these 7 weird, what we call wedding cake skyscrapers that were built during Stalin's times. They still stand there, these bizarre, almost Gothic-like structures. He is seen as kind of this very benevolent father of the nation. Any kind of abuses that are occurring under Stalin are often blamed on the actual functionaries. And of course, Stalin will be purging his functionaries every few years, reinforcing this idea that, oh my God, if only Uncle Stalin knew what they were doing. And sure enough, 3 years down the line, the abusive functionary is arrested and shot, and people are relieved. It's a message that Stalin is coming to straighten things out. And of course, what Stalin does is he then appoints a functionary even more abusive than the previous one, but just people cannot somehow resolve that in their mind. And it could be a Russian cultural thing as well. The Tsar is infallible. If only the Tsar knew what his functionaries are doing. And that's often this kind of Russian tendency to cloak the Tsar or the emperor or the party secretary with this kind of almost innocence of the details of abuses that are occurring. They just simply somehow, Russians could never believe that that is the source of their oppression. And often they look toward that very figure as hoping that they will eventually recognize the oppression and relieve the people of it. So he's seen as benevolent. And children, of course, see him as Papa Stalin, Uncle Stalin, Grandpa Stalin. The cult of personality, that's what we're talking about here. This famous picture of this little girl presenting Stalin with a picture and hugging him and kissing his hand. And of course, Stalin had just ordered several months earlier the murder of her father. So Stalin, by 1932, by the time Roosevelt is ready to recognize the Soviet Union, has become a dictator with unlimited powers. One of the first things that Stalin does is he begins to expand the Gulag. Gulag, the term first becomes known in the West after Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes his memoir of his time in the labor camp system. The book was called The Gulag Archipelago. This is what the archipelago looks like. It's a chain of labor camps that are very difficult to survive. These are brutal camps into which millions of Russians will be confined in and millions will die in. Gulag is an acronym. It means basically the state administration of the camp system. Gulag, Государственное управление лагерей, the state administration of camps, essentially. So it's the department that administrates the camps, essentially. And as I say, for the next 30 years, until the end of the 1950s, these slave labor camps will be used as part of the process of industrializing Russia, building its canals, its roadways and bridges, mining. Slave labor will become a great part of what is known as the Stalinist industrial miracle, as Stalin introduces these crash industrialization 5-year plans, and much of it is dependent on, like building of, again, canals, on forced slave labor. Stalin will also unleash massive purges, primarily again of the Communist Party. The more prominent you are in the Communist Party, the more likely it is that you will be arrested and replaced by a younger, more pliable, manageable member of the party. The more respectable your revolutionary pedigree, the more you are a threat to Stalin. And Stalin begins staging these notorious show trials that are carried on live radio broadcast in the 1930s. And one of the most amazing aspects of these trials is that all the defendants confess to some of the most outlandish accusations. And of course, the confessions are extracted through torture or through threats towards the family, which are carried out anyway. Confess or else your family will be put to death. And of course, it even becomes a crime in Russia to be related to someone who was arrested. And so these very public trials of not only prominent members of the Communist Party, but for example, engineers or managers, factory managers, when they cannot meet the production goals of the factories, are now accused of sabotage. They're put to death. Weathermen, if they make a mistake in their forecast, can be shot as saboteurs. And so almost any error can subject you to the death penalty or confinement, 20 years, 10 years, 7 years, routinely in the Gulag. In 1937 will be probably the most intense period in these executions. This is a period that's known as the Great Terror. It lasts 18 months from 1937 into 1938. In this period, Stalin will arrest 1.5 million Russians, and he'll execute 50% of them. So we're talking approximately 4,000 arrests a day. The executions become so rapid during the Great Terror that, and again, because they target prominent communist members, often the authorities don't have time to fix a portrait of a person who is executed. And so they begin to vanish. This is the beginning of Adobe Photoshop, as editors begin to just airbrush out victims that they cannot get these guys together in time before the next one is arrested to make an official portrait. So they're simply airbrushed out this way. Eventually, books where executed individuals, they didn't have enough time to revise them. For example, encyclopedias, they're published with the faces just blacked out at the last minute. Printers have to smear black ink over these faces of vanishing individuals. And so there's a whole genre of smeared out functionaries. And often it's done in a hierarchical way, as by that point it's also called the NKVD, as the Russian secret, I'll refer to it generically as the KGB, same organization, as the Russian secret police are arresting people in the hierarchy. Often if your picture appears next to someone whose face is blacked out, often you are the last one to go. In fact, you can see standing next to this individual with the blacked out face is Yazhov, who is the head of the Russian secret services and is the one who's actually executing the Great Terror for Stalin. In Russia, the Great Terror is known as the Yezhovshchina, named for Yazhov, that short little guy, also nicknamed as the Poison Dwarf. And of course, indeed, he will be next. Eventually, Stalin will, after 18 months of killing, as I say, where 750,000 Russians are put to death, Stalin will suddenly wake up one morning and say, oh my God, I've just discovered Yazhov has conducted all these executions without my authority. I'm going to replace him now with um, a more honest individual, and of course that will be Lavrenti Beria. And he gives instructions to Beria, of course, arrest Yezhov. He didn't kill enough people, kill him now. In the meantime, Stalin tells people, I've discovered Yezhov's abuses and I'll take care of it. Don't you worry, you won't be abused anymore. At the same time, as he instructs Beria, go kill twice as many as Yezhov. And of course, Yezhov vanishes like everyone else. They're still digging up these mass graves in Russia today, especially in the Gorbachev era. This was acknowledged and made public, and many of these graves were opened and people identified as best as they can be identified. The term in Russia was, if you were murdered, executed, technically the term was repressed. And the Russian government under Gorbachev and then eventually under Yeltsin would actually start issuing pardons to some people. I'm not quite sure if Trotsky was ever pardoned, because I imagine Trotsky now is as much an enemy ideological enemy to Putin as he would have been to Stalin. Stalin, of course, will notoriously purge his army as well on the eve of the German invasion of Russia. That will contribute, the fact that he wipes out nearly 80% of the most experienced officers, the ones that had fought in the First World War, in the Civil War, will be all shot. And of course, as the Germans invade Russia in 1941, Stalin desperately searches the Gulag for any remaining surviving officers who are sometimes deployed at the head of their armies, still wearing their Gulag prison outfit as they lead their units now into a desperate defense against the German onslaught in 1941. Here again, you can see during the either May Day parade or the October Revolution Day parade, when there's a parade in the Kremlin, the party functionaries often line up on this viewing platform on top of Lenin's tomb. Kremlinologists, as they become known, often analyze these photographs to determine who is in favor, who's falling out of favor. Well, here is a photograph taken of some of the most senior Russian generals on the eve of the purge, and the same photograph released several months later after the purge, and most of the generals have disappeared. It goes from this to this. And so if we look at the Central Committee of the Communist Party in 1917, by the end of Stalin's life, the X's are all the individuals who were executed. Others will die either through suicide or in the Civil War. Some will die of natural causes, leaving behind essentially three survivors by the 1950s. Most of them, as I say, will die at the hands of their own Communist Party, as someone once commented, all revolutions eat their young. And indeed, the Russian Revolution certainly ate its own young. Stalin will die of natural causes in 1953, and so only two members of the Communist Party will survive, one until 1959 and the other to 1966, and they're the only ones who die of natural causes after Stalin. Stalin essentially is an isolato, an isolated person. The only people who will be close to him are his mother, as you can see on the left, the head of his secret police, and the individual who will be in charge of the atomic bomb project, and we'll talk about him a little bit more later, Lavrentiy Beria. Lavrentiy Beria also comes from Georgia. Stalin brings him from Georgia. Stalin has a great suspicion of Russians, and certainly his Central Committee and Politburo, as he puts it together, is going to be filled with many ethnicities. Stalin is not that warm towards the Russians. And Lavrentiy Beria, even though he's from Georgia, he's actually comes from a sub-ethnicity in Georgia, the Mingrils. He's a Mingril, and so Lavrentiy Beria not only hates Russians, but he hates Georgians on top of that. So Lavrentiy Beria, a serial killer by no other name, will essentially happily murder millions of everybody, no matter what their ethnicity. And then you have his driver bodyguard, the individual in the back. So, as I say, Stalin really has no friends, at least none that he doesn't, kill. And the only other person he's going to be close to will be his second wife, Nadezhda Aluyeva. And Nadezhda Aluyeva is a very headstrong young woman who meets Stalin during the heady days of the revolution. He's a widower at that point. They become lovers, and in the period of the Russian Revolution, or shortly after, either 1918 or 1919, they will marry. She comes from a pedigreed revolutionary family. The Aluyevs are all revolutionaries. As I say, she herself is a very headstrong young woman. She'll move into the Kremlin with Stalin. She will eventually enroll in Moscow's technical university, where she's studying civil engineering. And in fact, it's there that Nadezhda Aluyeva will meet young Nikita Khrushchev, who's just come from the Ukraine, a former coal miner, peasant. Khrushchev is really a communist success story. Here is this barefooted Ukrainian peasant boy, coal miner, who manages to rise to eventually become the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin. Certainly in the 1950s and the early 1960s, he will be the contemporary of course, JFK, Khrushchev, and of Eisenhower. He is the success story of how the Communist Party can indeed empower someone who would have never even come close to the Kremlin to become, like I said, a leader of the Soviet Union. Again, a non-Russian. Stalin is at that point in time when Nadezhda is going to school, and Khrushchev is a fellow pupil and student in that engineering school. Stalin is looking for a commissar for nationalities. As you know, the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire consisted of over 100, I'm not sure, it's either 140 or 160 different ethnicities and nationalities. And so Stalin, in trying to kind of create this melting pot where there are no Russians, there are no Ukrainians, there are only Soviet citizens, kind of the way Tito will in Yugoslavia. There are no Serbs, Croats, or Bosnians. We're all Yugoslavians. Stalin, of course, is trying to now implement this policy towards various nationalities to create this kind of, again, melting pot of comrades. And Khrushchev is the ideal candidate. At Nadezhda's suggestion, Stalin meets with Khrushchev. He likes that Khrushchev is kind of a peasant. He's not an intellectual. He's very rough and tough, just the kind of man that Stalin will promote. And so Stalin brings Khrushchev into the Central Committee as the Commissar of Nationalities. That's Khrushchev's first function. And of course, Khrushchev will become the ultimate survivor as well. He'll survive all the purges and will survive Stalin's death and will survive the triumvirate that will rule Soviet Union after Stalin's death in '53, and eventually he will eliminate them and become himself the leader of Russia until the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 will eventually bring down Khrushchev inside of Russia. Stalin in the 1930s will also implement collectivization, which will, at the low estimate, kill nearly 6 million peasants, mostly in the Ukraine, where, of course, the Ukraine is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. And as Stalin is collectivizing all these individual farms into kolkhozes. Kolkhoz, again, is a acronym for collective хозяйство, collective farm, kolkhoz. And so peasants are stripped of all their food. They can't even take something they're growing for their own kitchen, and food is supposed to be redistributed throughout the Soviet Union, and it's a massive disaster with, as I say, millions of dying of famine. As there is resistance as well. Some are put down by force. Many peasants are just shot in the field. Others are deported into the Gulag as well. Ukrainians today often characterize this as a Holocaust, as a genocide. It's difficult to say whether Stalin intended to destroy the Ukrainians as an ethnicity, as a people, which certainly, if he did, would have been a fair characterization of a genocide, or whether he was destroying them as a class. And of course, Stalin is a class warrior. Communists are class warriors. And at this point, we don't define gender differences or class differences that are targeted by a state as an act of genocide. Genocide, of course, is defined as an attempt to destroy in whole or in part a people on the basis of their ethnicity, their creed, race, or religion, not their gender, nor necessarily their class. So historians argue on both sides whether the famine and the executions, the collectivization in the Ukraine was an ethnic phenomenon, or was this a class phenomenon, and was it just the fact that the Ukraine was the breadbasket that ended up so many Ukrainians being targeted? So this is for historians essentially to debate and resolve, and the debate is ongoing. Nonetheless, Stalin's wife will become very despondent over what her husband is doing. This is one of the last photographs of Nadezhda. By now, they of course have two children as well. Nadezhda begins to berate Stalin about the deaths that are occurring, the famine. Eventually, in 1932, she berates him at a dinner in the evening in the Kremlin. And what exactly happens again, it's unclear, but some of the witnesses at that dinner report that Stalin gets very angry and begins flicking lit cigarettes at Nadezhda at the dinner table, telling her to shut up. And Nadezhda now gets up and leaves the dinner table and locks herself in the bedroom. And now she does what is considered to be in Georgian culture as a great humiliation of a husband. She takes her handgun and she shoots herself in the heart, committing suicide in their bedroom. And this is a horrific humiliation for Stalin, that his wife would commit suicide. And some argue that this is where Stalin essentially goes off the wheel, his wheels come off, that Stalin now becomes paranoid and isolated, although this is the same story that is told of Ivan the Terrible, that after his wife is murdered by the boyars, the aristocracy, that Ivan the Terrible becomes terrible. But indeed, after 1932, Stalin becomes even more isolated, more paranoid, and begins to dig himself deeper into the kind of monster that he will become. Nadezhda is buried inside the Kremlin wall. After the fall of communism, her monument is moved into a cemetery, and that's where it is today, kind of protected with this iron ring and plexiglass in one of the cemeteries in Moscow. This is kind of the first crack in the picture that we get into Stalin's psychopathology. And so much in the cult of personality was generated by Stalin's propaganda, and as well the archives, where under Stalin, during Stalin's time, the archives were purged themselves. So we don't know much about Stalin's, for example, all his arrests, all those arrest records, because there are allegations that, like so many Bolsheviks, Stalin actually was a double agent and might have been an informant for the Imperial Russian secret police. That's why he survived so long while Lenin and Trotsky went into exile. Stalin managed to, although he was several times exiled and arrested, nonetheless managed to survive that revolutionary period in Russia. Was he an informant? Well, all these accusations, but we don't have any evidence, and we probably will never find one, because if there was, certainly Stalin would have ensured that it was destroyed. Nadezhda's disappearance is kind of left unsaid at that time in the 1930s. There's no public commentary on it, and a lot of Russians really didn't learn what happened until, again, the 1970s and the 1980s, with the story of Stalin's wife's suicide begins to come out. So a lot of discussion about Stalin, even after we get that period of de-Stalinization after 1956 under Khrushchev, even then there were certain aspects and certain names that would not be mentioned in Russia. two children, Svetlana, a daughter, and Vasily, a son, will be left behind. And what happens to both Vasily and Svetlana and Stalin's son by his first wife, Yakov, again tells us something about Stalin's psychopathology and his personality. Vasily will grow up to be this lout. He is the apple of his father's eye. He's a drunkard. He is promoted very quickly to become a general in the Air Force. He is completely incompetent. And in fact, at one point, he orders during a public demonstration of an air show, he orders an air show to be held, despite the fact that the weather is turning bad, because his father is in attendance there. And of course, there is this crash, and Vasily, of course, is held responsible for that. So his reputation is not very good. Vasily is corrupt. He uses his position. For example, his father catches him picking up girls. Vasily likes to tell girls, well, you know, I'm Stalin's son. You want to come up to the Kremlin? I'll show you his private office. When Stalin catches his son doing that, Stalin berates Vasily. He tells Vasily, and this tells us a lot about Stalin himself. He says to Vasily, you know, you can't be going around picking up women using the Stalin name. Even I am not Stalin. And what he meant by that is that all that propaganda, that cult of personality of who and what Stalin is, I realize that that's all bullshit. Even I'm not Stalin. Let's not kid ourselves who I am. And that is very different from Hitler. Hitler believed himself as being on a God's mission, being kind of endowed with destiny. Stalin did not necessarily feel that or believe that. He did not believe in his own propaganda. And this, you know, this incident between Vasily and his father, Stalin, tells us quite a bit about that. Vasily will remain after Stalin's death in 1953, will remain in the Soviet Union, and of course, once de-Stalinization begins, and many of Stalin's senior cohorts and allies are then put to death by the new Soviet regime, there'll be a leadership of actually three guys, Khrushchev included, and they will essentially purge Russia of the closest Stalinist followers. Vasily now, of course, becomes very frightened. He's worried that eventually his time will come, and so he becomes this kind of meek, cowering drunkard, essentially, who will drink himself to death by 1962. So he is this kind of wasted son, essentially. Yakov is a slightly different story. Yakov never gets along with Stalin, although he tries to win his father's wife. This is the son from the first marriage. At one point, Yakov becomes so despondent that he shoots himself. He attempts to shoot himself in the heart, but he misses. And Stalin pays him a visit in a hospital and berates him. You know, he calls his son an incompetent loser. You couldn't even kill yourself properly. Yakov is desperately trying to seek his father's approval, kind of a typical story in dysfunctional father and son relationships. When the Second World War breaks out, June 1941, when Germany invades Russia, Yakov will go to the front as an artillery officer. He's a lieutenant in the artillery. And in the Battle of Smolensk, Yakov is captured by the Germans. And this, of course, is a huge humiliation for both Yakov and Stalin. Stalin has ordered his men to never surrender, to fight to the last bullet and use the last bullet to commit suicide. Do not allow yourself to be captured by the enemy. His soldiers are expected to die fighting, or, as I say, to commit suicide when they run out of ammunition. Yakov instead surrenders, and of course, the intention here is to use Yakov as this propaganda figure against his father. And indeed, as Stalin is ordering his men to fight to the death, the Germans are issuing these leaflets that proclaim, hey, Russians, do you know who this is? While your husbands and brothers and fathers are fighting to the death, the leader's son has surrendered and is, in a Russian, in a POW camp, right? Working with the Germans. There's a photograph there you can see of Yakov walking with Germans. And this is exactly what Stalin was worried about, that Yakov will now become this propaganda tool for the Germans. And when Yakov is captured, Stalin's first remark is, incompetent idiot. He couldn't even die on the battlefield. He screwed this up right to the end. Yakov, to his credit, refuses to cooperate with the Germans in any way. And Yakov ends up being confined in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany. After the Battle of Stalingrad, when the Russians destroy the 4th Panzer Army and the 6th Infantry Army, which was commanded by Field Marshal Paulus, von Paulus, they capture Paulus. Paulus, of course, was promoted to Field Marshal because in German history, no German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive. And so just shortly before Paulus surrenders, Hitler actually promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, sending him a message, before you surrender, commit suicide. And Paulus, of course, declines to do that. And so Paulus becomes the first German Field Marshal captured. Hitler offers to Stalin to return his son in exchange for Field Marshal Paulus. And Stalin reportedly replied, well, a Russian lieutenant is not worth a German Field Marshal, and refuses to take his son back in exchange for Paulus. At some point, we don't know exactly what happened, but Yakov ends up either shot or commits suicide by throwing himself on the electric barbed wire at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. And this is when Stalin gets the news that his son has committed suicide or was shot, but I think the story was that he had committed suicide. Stalin, for the first time, acknowledges his son and says, at last, Jakob is my son. He did the right thing. And so that tells us again so much about Stalin's personality, what he will be. He's certainly not the aristocrat Roosevelt, or even the military officer Eisenhower, or the Southern politician that Truman was, all these US presidents that Stalin will be dealing with. This is, a species of politician very much alien, certainly to the American and even British experience. Churchill himself will be, an aristocrat. So this kind of individual is going to characterize again the kind of relationships the United States is going to now have throughout the 1930s, 40s, and into the beginning of the 1950s with a Russia led by this individual. This leaves Stalin with one daughter, Svetlana, who he apparently dotes upon. She is, by all means, his favorite. She's a constant companion in the Kremlin, in the summer dacha just outside at Kuncevo, where Stalin keeps this villa behind this high wall. He spends much of his time there. Often Kremlin officials have to take, it's about a maybe 30-minute, 25-minute drive from the Kremlin, I guess, with a police escort, no traffic to Kuncevo. That's where Stalin will be spending most of his time, and he's only in the Kremlin for formal occasions, and Svetlana will be there. Relationships between the father and the daughter begin to sour once Svetlana begins to date. Stalin kind of is a very conservative and protective father, and so he has a tendency to arrest and execute her dates, and so very quickly, Svetlana can't get a date, and so all these tensions begin to arise between Svetlana and the father. Typical kind of adolescent, teenage dating angst that often characterizes many father-daughter relations, except most fathers don't have the gulag and the secret police at their fingertips to deal with suitors and boys calling. Svetlana will remain in the Soviet Union after her father's death in 1953, but then in the 1960s, she'll kind of rebel and actually defect. She'll have a number of marriages. Eventually, she'll also marry somebody from India. She'll live in India for a while with her husband. Then she'll return to the Soviet Union, to Russia. Then she'll live in England, and eventually, his daughter will end up settling in the United States, in Wisconsin, where she raises another daughter in Wisconsin. Svetlana will remain mostly isolated, though she does give a few television interviews, a few press interviews, but mostly she lives in a retirement home in Wisconsin, where in 2011 she'll eventually pass away just from natural causes. The last of the Stalin children that we know of. The daughter, Stalin's granddaughter, is this kind of figure in punk and fashion in Oregon. Stalin, I'm sure, is spinning in his grave. But there you go, Stalin's granddaughter. Again, there's a certain irony to history. So that, again, gives you at least some insight into this personality that is going to be wielding power and essentially dealing directly with the United States in the conduct of their foreign relations with them. As I say, Stalin here, you can see the triumvirate that is rising up around Stalin. This is around the period of the Korean War in the last years of Stalin's life. You can see from the right Molotov, the man of, Stalin, of course, means man of steel. That's his revolutionary name. On the right, you see Molotov, which means the man of hammer, the hammer man. Next to him is Beria, then Malenkov, and then Khrushchev. These guys will succeed Stalin after his death in the winter of 1953, and then Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Molotov will turn on Beria, who's the greatest threat. They'll eliminate Beria, who is, as I say, ahead of the atomic bomb project, as well as the secret police, and then Khrushchev will slowly eliminate Malenkov and Molotov to eventually rise to power by the mid-1950s. So there is this kind of unstable period, roughly a 2-year period, 3-year period, where people are going to be fighting to take Stalin's position. But Stalin, as I say, will take us all the way into the Korean War. So from 1924 till 1953, Russian policy is essentially Stalin's policy. And this is going to, of course, change because Russian-American relations, again, it was a kind of a bipolar world. You had the Russian imperial system versus the American Republic. Then you have this bipolar system, again, the American Republic and a Russian Republic. You have two republics in this bipolar system, of course, but both republics have a completely different ideology. One is free enterprise capital. The other is, of course, central economic planning communism. Even though they're both republics, there are these fundamental economic models, and as critical we are of democracy in the United States, I don't think we can characterize the United States as the kind of totalitarian state that the Russian Republic, the Soviet Republic, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, is in the time of Stalin and perhaps becoming now in the time of Putin. It definitely is a totalitarian state. What is going to significantly have impact on the relations between the reestablished relations between the United States and the Soviet Union under Roosevelt and Stalin will be suddenly the emergence for the next at least 12 years of a third ideology, National Socialism, fascism, right-wing totalitarianism. And so we have this period between 1933 and 1945 of a tripartite world of three ideologies, a kind of constellation that is going to make each party, each pole, reconsider its position in relation to the other. All three are emerging in 1933 as Roosevelt is being inaugurated into his presidency. Hitler is taking power. The world is very rapidly changing. And so, certainly, when Roosevelt in November of 1933 reestablishes relations with Russia, Roosevelt has one eye on this new rising ideology that is emerging in Germany, National Socialism. And how now the United States and Russia are going to interact is going to be very much a reflection of what the Nazis are going to be doing in Europe. And so we're in the next lecture, I'm going to take a look at the rise of Hitler and the relations between the United States, Russia, and Germany, and how these will shape the world in which we live in today and continue to shape Russian-American relations to this day.